Alright, Suchi's going to introduce you. Invite people to come listen.
Hi everyone! So my name is Suchi, if you don't know me. I'm the Kohn Lecture coordinator for the Speaking Fellows this year. And we'll be giving 2 Kohn Lectures today right here. And if you're out in iZone, feel free to join in at any point. So first up we have Cameron Morgan, who's a Speaking Fellow alumni. He graduated from the U of R in 2019 with degrees in linguistics and brain and cognitive sciences, and a Take 5 program in disability, stigma, and identity. He was a Speaking Fellow from 2016 through the end of his time at U of R, and was the president of the Speaking Fellows from 2017 through 2019. Today he works remotely as a manager in insurance operations, and he'll be drawing on his personal and professional interpersonal experience to discuss effective remote communication in the virtual world.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Suchi. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and get started with my presentation today, which is titled, Can You Hear Me Now? Effective Remote Communication in a Virtual World. So first I want to start with a roadmap, give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start with context, relevance, what I mean by remote communication and why I think it's important. Elements of effective remote communication as I have developed them. Common pitfalls that I think are important to avoid. And lastly, we'll finish off with a conclusion and some closing thoughts. We're going to start with context and relevance, of course. So I want to start by giving you a bit of a limiting definition on remote communication as I'm going to talk about it today. And that is that we're going to focus on spoken virtual communication, which is to say phone calls, video calls, etc. with colleagues and friends. So I will be talking about both personal social communication as well as professional communication, but specifically I'm limiting this to spoken communication. So don't expect to come away from this with strategies to craft an effective email or anything like that, though I'm sure the Writing Fellows or Read Center can help you out if you are interested. So let's start by talking a little bit about remote work. Maintaining strong, clear communication in a remote workplace poses unique challenges. How can you feel connected with colleagues that you might never have met before and don't have good context on how they might interact with you in person? How do you effectively brainstorm or collaborate with folks that you're not sharing a space with? More tools and systems might come into play in order to make that collaboration and communication effective, but counterintuitively, those can sometimes make you feel progressively more disconnected from each other the more complex it gets. So I think that this is something important to think about here. It is easy to feel isolated, disengaged, and uninvested from one another in the workplace. And I think that this can hugely impact how openly and honestly we can communicate and collaborate with one another. And lastly, beyond just people's perceptions, there is indeed research that shows that collaboration and problem solving in a remote workplace can suffer, particularly without mindful and engaged communication. I want to take a quick moment to say that I am a proponent of remote work. I'm not presenting these challenges with a means to lobby against remote work, but I just want to clarify that these challenges are something that I think can be overcome, and I think effective communication and mindful communication is one of the most important strategies to do that. All right, here we do see a 2024 survey shows results that 71% of white-collar workers with a bachelor's degree or higher work remotely in part or in full. So we can see here over in this graph that there's a mix of about 30% of fully remote workers in that purple shade, and then about 41% of hybrid workers, folks that work some mix of remotely and in person in the green shade. But collectively, these results show from this survey that about 71% of white-collar workers with a bachelor's degree do work remotely as of this 2024 survey. So while there has been some discourse that remote work is like a fad or a remnant of the peak of COVID-19, current data shows that it is still alive and well. And so I think being prepared for the reality of remote work is an important thing moving forward. All right. But besides remote work, remote socialization is also an important part of our lives and probably will be for a long time. Maintaining long-distance relationships with partners, friends, and families remotely can be challenging. You've probably already all experienced this with your family, with your childhood friends. It isn't an easy thing to do. We might feel disconnected, we might struggle to stay in touch, we might struggle to feel engaged with one another on like a phone call or looking at each other through a screen. But I think that it is important that we do our best to tackle these challenges. And I want to share just a couple more pieces of context here with remote socialization. So results from a 2022 survey showed that about 1 in 5 partnered adults under the age of 30 met their partner online. I am a part of that statistic. I am 1 in 5 that did the same. And even without dating apps, I think that it is increasingly common to potentially meet a romantic partner online. After university, the workplace has long been a common place to meet your spouse or partner, and think back to those remote work statistics that I just covered. If you are working fully remotely and you are meeting your spouse through work, you're meeting your spouse online, right? So with such a at least non-trivial chance of meeting a romantic partner online or remotely, I think that it's important to be prepared for remote communication. But even without any desire or interest in meeting a romantic partner, you will absolutely want to maintain some long-distance friendships after graduation, right? You are alumni end up all over the world. And so I think that being prepared to maintain those friendships in a tenable and sustainable way through effective communication is really important. All right, my experience. Why am I standing up here in front of you talking to you about this? What do I have to add to this conversation? So first, work. I've worked remotely for my entire career. I have colleagues that are located from California to Georgia to the Philippines to South Africa. I am constantly coaching and collaborating and brainstorming and problem solving with folks from literally all over the world, quite literally on a daily basis, at least daily with respect to the workday. And so I have cultivated a lot of thoughts and ideas and skills with respect to this. And outside of work, my closest friends are scattered from Seattle to Boston, some of those UR grads. And also, my partner is Canadian, and he and I met online, and we've had a long-distance relationship for about 5 years now. I do want to specifically mention as well that the early part of those 5 years encompassed March 2020 through August 2021. And if any of you have already put the pieces together, that encompassed the height of the COVID pandemic, during which the Canadian-American border was entirely closed. So for those 17 months, we did not see each other in person at all. We sustained the relationship entirely through remote communication. And while there are a lot of pieces to that, I do genuinely believe that our capacity for remote communication and the way that we were able to invest in one another through that and be mindful of how we communicated with each other was a big part of it. Okay, there we go. So all of that being said, effective remote communication has been a cornerstone of my career development and my interpersonal relationships for my entire adult life. And so I would really love to now share with you what I consider are some of the elements of effective remote communication. All right, we're going to start with a clear purpose. So simply consider for a second, what's the reason that I'm making this call, or why was this scheduled? Obviously, if you're getting an impromptu or unscheduled call from a friend or a colleague, that's not your question to answer. Hopefully they have answered that. But if you're the one reaching out, or if this is scheduled, I encourage you to think about this a little bit. Now, the purpose may be very simple. And I did say a moment ago that this applies to both work as well as social calls. And you might be thinking that second part is funny. You might be thinking like, my purpose, like I'm calling my friend because I want to catch up with my friend. What do you mean think about my purpose? And to be clear, that's totally fine. I think that if your purpose is truly that you want to catch up with your friend, that's great. And 9 out of 10 times, that might be enough. But if you think about it a little more, if you at least give yourself the opportunity to think about it, sometimes you might articulate something else. Maybe you're thinking about how long it's been since you last spoke to this friend who lives in another state or another country. And it's making you a little sad to think about how long it now is that you go without speaking to this person who was once a very close and important part of your life. And so maybe your purpose for this call is to come out of it with some sort of idea or plan to talk with them more often. and that might impact how you close out the call, or what you talk about at the end, or actually scheduling something, right? On the other hand, maybe you're thinking about the last time that you talked with this person, maybe it wasn't that long ago, and you're trying to remember what you talked about, and you're realizing that you didn't retain that much of what you were talking about, and you're starting to have a little bit of insecurity that maybe you're not being the most engaged and active listener when you're talking to them, and maybe now, with that purpose in mind, it might not change what you talk about in this call, but it might well change how you approach it, or what it is that you're thinking about, or what you're doing while you're talking with them, right? So for social calls, just consider if you need any special settings, scheduling, follow-up, whether it is appropriate or is not, that you're doing this while you're like doing laundry, doing the dishes. Sometimes that's perfectly fine. Other times you might need to think about whether you need to kind of refocus and settle in on it a little bit. For work meetings, I think that all of the above applies, but also I would highly recommend that you prepare like an agenda or discussion items. And if that's a one-on-one call, that's very simple. If it's a group call, it may or may not be appropriate for you to be the one to prepare those. You can use your judgment on that, obviously. And my last point here is don't overschedule. So I do specifically mean this piece with respect to the work environment. So there is research that shows that having back-to-back remote virtual meetings with your camera on, kind of unyielding day after day, is a pretty significant stress of remote work fatigue. Now I do think that there is a benefit to having meetings with your camera on. I'll talk about that in a moment. But my point here is that if you are absolutely loading up your colleagues' schedules with call after call, and there's not a clear and sufficient purpose to do so, you're really increasing the chances that they are walking away from these thinking, this is not a good use of my time, and I don't like having these calls. So really just critically consider, hey, do I have a purpose for this right now? All right, the next piece here is active listening. So the primary aim with active listening is not to respond or to wait until you're cued explicitly, right? The aim is to truly understand the speaker's perspective. This is not an easy thing to do. And admittedly, even in face-to-face communication, this can be difficult. It's pretty easy to tune out if you're having a long conversation with somebody. But remotely, I think this is even more difficult because of the disconnectedness that we're feeling, the distractions that are very prevalent on our computers, the sense that you are just kind of like listening to a disembodied voice through a screen or through your phone. This becomes even more challenging, it does. But I think there are a few strategies to combat this. Firstly, avoid distractions. Also ask questions and paraphrase and summarize along the way to confirm your understanding. So avoiding distractions, I think that's pretty obvious, but can be easier said than done when you are having the call on your phone or on a computer. So it's something to just mindfully think about. Asking questions, I think if you're trying to clear up confusion or ambiguity, really important that you ask those questions along the way to really leave the call confident that you're on the same page with that other person. Or if this is a social call, maybe you're not asking questions to like clear up something you didn't understand, but you're actively participating in the conversation. Your friend's telling you about something that's interesting, and you want to be an active participant in that conversation, learn a little bit more about it. I think that goes a long way to showing that you are actively engaged in the conversation. And then paraphrase and summarize to confirm your understanding. Again, use your judgment with this one. You don't want to constantly interrupt or like constantly mime what someone else is saying. But whenever something in, for example, a work meeting is coming up that is particularly important or complicated, taking the opportunity to just pause for a moment and say, so I hear you saying X, is that right? Am I with you? I think that can be really effective when done sparingly. Next is tangibility, how real, definite, clear your communication feels. So I think that replicating aspects of in-person and written communication can help quite a bit. If you are just a disembodied voice coming from a phone or from a screen, that doesn't bode well for their connectedness and for how real this all feels to them. And so I think that there are several things here that we can do to combat this. Firstly, encourage video calling using your cameras when agreeable to benefit from facial expressions, body language, and just a general sense of connectedness. There is some research that shows that very tangibly how connected we feel with one another when we can see each other through a camera does make a big difference in contrast to just hearing one another's voice through a screen without any sort of pair there. So that's something to think about, and what I would highly recommend whether you are in a work call or whether you are just taking a social call. My next piece here is that when appropriate, I would recommend that you share your screens, slides, a written summary, or discussion points. Sharing slides, a written summary, discussion points, those are obviously more suited to a work call, right? But sharing your screen is something that I think you can do in a social call as well. If you're catching your friend up on something that you saw on social media that you thought was interesting or funny or just worth talking about, taking a moment through FaceTime or WhatsApp or whatever it is that you might be using to share your screen and show them what it is that you're talking about. I think that's a nice touch. You don't have to do that with everything. I think there is also value and beauty in just using your words to communicate with somebody. But again, doing this sparingly can be a nice grounding touch for someone. All right, my next aspect here is follow-up. I mentioned earlier that I'd be focusing on spoken remote communication. This is a bit of an exception. I think that following up in writing after you have some sort of call or meeting is a very great, tangible touch. I think that this is something that can really push through the disconnectedness that someone would feel. So after work calls, you can send an email or DM with meeting notes, boys, or just your thanks. I really do think that this is, again, a really nice touch. Someone who has a very busy schedule of calls at work might sort of just be going through the motions as they're taking all of these. And I think that you're taking a moment to follow up with them and kind of give them some sort of firm reminder or sign that hey, this was something that you and I both experienced together, and I'm with you and I'm excited to be working with you, and I have these thoughts, or you have my thanks. That can really go a long way. That can really be pretty profound. So I do like to think about that. I do like to implement that. The social calls, you can send a text or a DM to say thanks for catching up or to follow up on something that they mentioned. You can decide how often that's appropriate or what feels genuine. But I think, again, this can be something that is really nice to combat that disconnectedness I've been talking about. Lastly, keep your commitments and share updates. When we go longer periods of time in a remote environment without hearing from someone or seeing someone, I think that whether or not you keep commitments that you've agreed to will more quickly make a more significant impression in what they think of you and how that impacts their perception of you. So in turn, I think that when you do commit to something, do your best to follow through with it, and whenever you just need a little more time with something, just actively communicate about that. Keep them posted, and don't leave people in the dark. All right, so with those elements of effective remote communication set, I'm going to move on to a few common pitfalls that I recommend you avoid. All right, so firstly, disengagement. So this is something that is extremely common in a remote workplace and can even be common in a remote call with friends. It's the antithesis of active listening. So rather than listening intently to understand, you might be multitasking and giving the conversation less than half your attention or your efforts. You might be waiting until they say something that feels like a cue to you, something like that. Consider how you'd behave if you were having a face-to-face conversation instead of a remote conversation. I think this is a very easy way to combat disengagement on your end. Think about, hey, if I were talking to this person face-to-face, would I be pulling out my phone to respond to a text as they are standing in front of me watching me do that? Or would I be writing down my thoughts about an unrelated conversation I know I'm going to be having later today? I think for most people the answer to those questions is no. But I think that it's actually so commonly what people are doing in remote work, right? When they just have everything up in front of them on their screen, tabs with their email and what they've been working on, as well as the meeting, and they're just navigating through all of it very quickly and simultaneously, and I don't think that bodes well for engagement. To preempt your listeners' disengagement, you can implement tangible elements of communication like we just talked about, because while you can go into the call determined that you won't be disengaged, you can't necessarily control your listeners' intention from the beginning. And then after disengagement, I'm going to talk a little bit now about ambiguity. So in a remote work environment, ambiguity is very likely due to our disconnectedness. So we're working less closely with one another. In a fully remote work environment, we might have never met the person face to face, and so it is really difficult to feel connected to a colleague in that environment. And I've already discussed a variety of other reasons that we might feel disconnectedness in a remote environment that also impacts social calls as well. We have fewer and less detailed social cues available to us. Even when we are using cameras, it's not as full or as broad as what we might see face to face, and that makes interpretation challenging. Speak with clarity, purpose, and intent. Listen actively, and be willing to ask questions. And I think that if you're implementing all of these together, that's a great way to really get ahead of any ambiguity that you might be feeling. All right, lastly, shortcuts. All right, so behind a screen, I think that you might feel emboldened to rush through or skip the path to success. So I've talked a great deal about feeling disconnected in a remote work environment, and I think that that disconnectedness might give you a sense of invulnerability that in turn makes you feel a little safer when you are not giving something your full effort or not creating something that you take pride in. And I think that obviously that can apply to a lot of different tasks and responsibilities and deliverables, but what I mean here is that I think this is really common with communication, when you need to prepare to talk to someone about something, present something, really exchange ideas with someone. It's really common to feel emboldened to kind of skirt and get around something a little more easily here. But I think that this often results in very clear unpreparedness, and I think that it is very unlikely that you are able to fool someone and you have not put in the time and effort that you should have to understand something that you're going to be presenting or discussing with them. I also want to make a quick point here that I think dependence on AI can really be debilitating. Sorry folks, screen froze for a second. So with AI, I think that people are using AI in all sorts of ways to attempt to replace what goes into having a proper conversation with someone or to doing the work that they ought to be prepared to discuss something. People are using AI note takers to basically skip attending meetings and not be present and not see the communication and the social cues that are unspoken that are happening in front of them and are being exhibited by their coworkers. People are using ChatGPT to basically create entire presentations, and I should know, that's what I did with this. It was a joke, see if you're still listening. So I think that all of this can be really detrimental, and I don't mean to tell you what tools you can't have in your tool belt or in your process. I'm just saying that you should be mindful when you are actually approaching discussion and communication and properly exchanging ideas with someone, what actually constitutes good preparation. And ultimately, this is all to say that you should take the same pride in your communication and your presence that you would if you were in person. All right, that brings us to our conclusion, folks. So despite the challenges of remote communication, it will remain a very significant part of our personal and professional lives, and I think that it's very important that we prepare for this. A clear purpose, active listening, tangibility, and follow-up, I think will improve your remote communication immensely. These are all of the elements of effective remote communication that I mentioned. And lastly, I think that you should avoid disengagement, ambiguity, and shortcuts in order to make sure that you are having communication and exchanges that you can be proud of and that are meaningful. And I believe that with mindful communication, we can overcome the disconnectedness and the isolation of a virtual world. Thank you all.
Yeah, it won't let me hit slideshow until I connect to the Wi-Fi, which I don't know why it's not working. Oh, is it?
Probably.
I think I ran over. Like I was looking at a time and I was good.
There's pizza down here if you'd like some.
Okay, so next up, me and Campbell will be giving our Kohn lecture. I'll introduce Campbell a little bit. Oh, yours? Oh, come on up.
No, I'm not prepared. I'm holding pizza.
Okay, I'll do it. So this is Campbell. She is a senior class of 2025, major in creative writing, and she is one of our amazing speaking fellows.
Woo! Yeah, Campbell!
There's also me.
Woo!
I'm also a senior, class of 2025.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm a statistics major, and here we are. All right, so we'll just get started. So today we wanted to talk about our experience through the Speaking Fellows. It's taught us a lot. Hopefully we've taught some people some things as well, and we kind of wanted to share our reflections and thoughts on that experience.
So a little bit of our outline. First off, we're going to talk about our experiences with public speaking prior to coming to the University of Rochester. After that, we'll talk about how those experiences changed once we became speaking fellows. And then third, we'll cover the role of the tutor. And then fourth, we'll talk about our takeaways after our few years as a speaking fellow. So first up, how we were taught public speaking prior to coming here. So for me, public speaking was just presentations. That was the only type of public speaking I had ever heard of. And this was usually in elementary school and middle school, not much in high school. And this consisted of being given a prompt and having criteria to cover, and that was the most important thing. Content was all my teachers really cared about. And I remember one time, I think I was in 5th grade, our prompt was to make a presentation on your favorite animal. So I made a presentation on a snow leopard and printed out all these beautiful pictures and painted it my favorite color blue, and it looked awesome. But I remember having to get the biggest poster board I could find because I had to print out all of my captions large enough so that I could read them while I was presenting. So this tells you a little bit about what I knew about delivery, which was nothing. I didn't know that was a thing, I didn't know why it mattered, and no one ever really explained it or corrected it. And I believe I got what you could get of an A in elementary school on that presentation.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience to Campbell in school. I always felt like we talked about writing all the time as a process from elementary school to high school. We do it every single year, throughout the year, and we have so many ways to get feedback and practice with writing, whether that's through peer review or doing like rounds of feedback with your professor or your teacher at present school. And that is never something that we got to experience with public speaking. And I always felt like it was something that some people just had innately and that other people didn't. It never felt like something that we were meant to practice or work on, and it never was presented to me in that kind of light. And when we did presentations, it would be like one time a year. So we never really got that exposure to it the way I felt like we did with writing. And it just felt like something that I had to memorize. And my main goal was to just remember the content that I prepared, memorize it, and just say it out loud. But there was no thought about the art of it or putting anything of myself into it. It was never really something we got to think of in that light. But Campbell and I both became speaking fellows. In our sophomore year, we took the training class for it, and so we've been doing it for almost 3 semesters now. And that's been a really eye-opening experience for us in a lot of different ways.
So the biggest thing I learned from becoming a speaking fellow was that your speaking skills can develop. This is something that you can learn and grow and work on as much as you choose to work on it. Practice makes perfect, just like anything else you do. And this is something that I didn't know before. Like Suchi said, I thought you were either good at it and you were a good speaker or you weren't. But through becoming a speaking fellow, I learned that that's not the case and you can get better if you choose to. And I also learned that there's many different kinds of public speaking, so it's not all about presentations. And I think the one that stood out to me was we have a lot of sessions where people are coming in for conversation practice, And this is never something I really thought of as public speaking, but through working with these students, I've learned how important it is and how much it really does matter, and how much you can work on those skills. And then also I learned about delivery, kind of the basics, eye contact, hand gestures, your tone, your body positioning. But I also learned why this matters in public speaking. I learned how you can emphasize in things that you're saying and how you say them by the way you present yourself. And I learned how much it can change what you're saying is how you say it. And I also really learned to love public speaking. So I wasn't much of a hater. It was kind of just whatever to me. I didn't really care, but I didn't love it. But after becoming a speaking fellow, I like public speaking and I like doing things like this. And in classes, when I get an assignment for a presentation, I'm relieved. I'm like, oh yes, this is great. This is awesome. Here we go. And I really love that journey and kind of finding my own voice in that way.
Yeah, so again, a little bit of a similar journey, but a little different in other ways. So a huge takeaway for me that it's a teachable, learnable, practicable skill. But for me, one thing that I really learned about public speaking is that it's not just a means of communication, but also an art and a way to express yourself. And a concept that we talked a lot about in the course was linguistic justice, and that really opened my eyes to a whole way of thinking about language and speaking that maybe had floated in my subconscious for a while, but that I'd never had to articulate really until we talked about it in that class. So linguistic justice is this idea that everyone's dialect or accent or the way that they speak is a part of their identity and not something that we should try to conform to white mainstream English or any other kind of standard. And that the important thing is that one can use their language as a tool to express themselves and to represent their ideas and to communicate that to other people, regardless of what their language might look like or sound like outside of that. And that to me was really, really meaningful, and it made me reflect on how I can use language and use that as a tool to express myself, and also how I can help empower other people to use their language to express their own identity and their own thoughts. So that was a really meaningful part of the course for me. And then of course, I've also found more fun in public speaking now than I had before. Definitely for me, I was a little bit more of a hater than Campbell probably was. And it really was something that I didn't look forward to. But now it's something that I can confidently say that I can not only enjoy standing up in front of a group of people and presenting, but also enjoy the process leading up to that.
So next we're going to be talking about the role of the tutor, and this is something that Suchi and I really wanted to talk about because it's often focused on the student coming into the room, and we kind of wanted to reverse the lens and talk a little bit about what we're doing on our side, so everyone's kind of a little more educated on what's going on in the entirety of the session. So first up is creating a welcoming environment. So this is something that's really important to us at the Speaking Fellows. We want to make sure that everyone coming in feels safe and feels comfortable in those sessions. This is because speaking can be a very vulnerable thing for a variety of reasons. The first is speech anxiety. So almost everyone faces some form of speech anxiety in some threshold, some way, somehow. And this is something that can be obviously very anxiety-provoking and nervous and hard to talk about. But usually after talking through it and kind of opening up about it, you're able to come to a place where you can embrace this anxiety and kind of accept it and work through it. So we want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable to talk about this. Secondly, expressing your past stories and sharing about yourself is important in some of these sessions because we'll talk about how you feel about public speaking and kind of reflecting on times where you have done that and how it's gone for you. And sometimes, depending on your experience, this can be vulnerable and it can be hard to talk about past experiences. And lastly, as people who are coming in as English is their second language or it's a new language to them, it can be anxiety-provoking and nervous to make a mistake or say something wrong. And we just want to make sure that we're creating a space where it's safe and welcome for everyone to be able to kind of try things out and grow their skills and work on themselves as a speaker. And a couple ways we do this is starting with the opening rapport. So this is spending the first kind of 5 to 10 minutes of our sessions just getting to know each other, not even talking about the session goals yet or anything like that. Just asking about their background, asking about their day, kind of how they're doing. And usually through this you can find some common ground to connect with each other And then that makes the session moving forward so much more comfortable and welcoming. And also as speaking fellows, we like to provide encouragement along with criticism. So students usually undermine themselves, but when they're coming into the speaking fellows, they're probably already doing some things that are good and are working for them. And we just like to point these things out so they know that they're doing the right thing. And an important line for us to kind of walk is being friendly versus being professional. And so, like I said, opening rapport, kind of just getting to know each other, but we're making sure this is not too intrusive. So something that I would talk about with my friends is not necessarily something I need to talk about in the opening rapport. And it's kind of just finding this line of a friendly professionalism. And it's also important to stay focused on the type of session you have. So if I'm having a conversation practice, I'm going to be much more friendly and laid back and asking questions and asking different questions than I would in an interview practice where I'm kind of taking on the role of an interviewer. And it's just important in these sessions to recognize the students' goals and stay focused on those and kind of finding that boundary based off of that session. And also how you present yourself in a physical way conveys your professionalism. So staying focused and kind of engaged in the conversation versus being backed out of it or much more lax is important in these sessions. And then at the end, we always want to return to professionalism because ultimately the student's coming there to learn from you or to practice. And even with things like conversation practice, at the end of sessions, we like to return to kind of helping them and kind of teaching them and pointing out things we can to help them grow as a speaker. So we kind of put that professional hat back on and provide that advice.
Alright, so another really important part of being a speaking fellow is cultural competency. And of course that has connotations of being aware of other people's cultures and being respectful of that. But also something important that I wanted to note is that the students who come into the tutoring center are very diverse, and diversity can mean a lot of different things. Students can be diverse in terms of being undergrads, graduate students, PhDs, or even faculty and staff at the U of R. They can be diverse in their past experiences of public speaking. Some people love it and they do it all the time. Some people hate it and it's like their worst nightmare and they're here to get support in that way. There's also diversity in what part of the process they're in. Someone could be in the first brainstorm stage of their presentation or project or whatever they're working on, and someone else might be kind of on their final draft and they need someone to listen to them and practice. So in all these situations, people come from really different backgrounds. They can have different learning styles. They might have different needs from the session. So it's important to just go into it knowing that and having that open-mindedness. And the other thing about cultural competency is that no one is expected to know everything about every background or to always know where someone is coming from, but the important thing as a tutor is to keep that open-mindedness and really be a listener to what the student needs and keep the session focused on how can we help them, how can we help this person reach their goals, no matter what background they come from, whether you share things in common with them or not. So a common type of client that we get at the tutoring center are non-native English speakers who are looking to practice their English, whether that's conversationally or in a presentation or in a discussion or whatever other situation they might need to use it in. And a lot of times they can be worried about a lot of different things, whether that's cultural differences in language or even just making grammatical errors. And a lot of times they worry about what they're saying not being understood by their audience. And of course, learning any language is a process that takes a long time. And in a 15-minute session, we can't guarantee that you can become fluent in English after that point. But what we try to emphasize is that what they're saying and the content that they're trying to convey to their audience is important and that they can be understood. That no matter what stage of learning English they're in, their language and the things that they know have importance. And we want to really improve their confidence and in their ability to communicate things. And so that is how we try to focus our session, even when there's a lot of other things that they might be worried about. And of course, going back to that idea of linguistic justice, we're not trying to change how people speak, but rather we're trying to empower them to find their own style of speaking, whatever that may look like, and help them use that style to their maximum effectiveness in order to convey their ideas best. So along those similar lines, it's really important to be creative and also flexible in the tutoring room. So the things that are useful to me that I might suggest to a tutee might not actually be helpful to them because everyone learns in a different way, everyone needs a different thing. So it's important for us to keep a variety of activities or tactics or things that we can kind of try out in the session depending on whoever comes into the room. A lot of times we have repeat sessions where a student will come in regularly, and keeping those sessions fresh and keeping those goals renewed as we go on is really important, so we're not doing the same thing week in and week out. And sometimes someone will come in with something that you've never seen before. They'll ask you for help on something you don't know anything about. And so being able to think on your feet and come up with something that might help is really important, and being able to use the resources that we have at hand. But on that note, asking for feedback throughout this process is something that I've really learned how to do. Because you don't always know if what you're doing is helpful to that student in that particular context. So I like to ask throughout the session for feedback. So if we've done a certain activity, practicing a certain interview question, we talk about it, we reflect on it, and then I'll ask them, was that helpful to you? Do you want to keep going, asking question by question and reflecting on them later? Or do you want us to do like a 20-minute full interview practice and then reflect on the whole thing later so it feels more like an immersive experience? And based on what they say, I try to meet what they need and what they think is more helpful. And so being able to pivot approaches is really, really helpful, and offering them choices so that they can pick how they want the session to go, rather than me enforcing my opinions on, I think this is the most helpful way to do it, is really important. And it's important to not take that stuff personally. Like if you came up with this activity and you thought it was brilliant, and they say, that's not really helping me, can we try something else? I try to remember that the students' needs are at the center of this relationship, and I'm here to be a support to them, and my feelings on that matter are a little bit less important than trying to meet their goals and needs.
Yeah, and a little bit vice versa on that, so giving feedback as a tutor. One very important thing is being a true audience member, so focusing on where the student is going to kind of give this presentation or have this conversation, and really taking on the role of that audience member and giving feedback based off of that. So whether this be a conversation that they want to practice with a professor, or they're applying for this internship, really learning about that character and playing that role. And then the most important thing about giving feedback as a tutor is remaining non-directive. So as we talked about, public speaking is a skill that can be developed, and it can be learned and kind of taught in practice, but there's not one right answer, and this answer is different for everyone. So in sessions, we're not giving you that right answer because it doesn't exist. You kind of have to find what that is for yourself. So we are just providing guidance for you to kind of learn your journey of what your right answer in public speaking is. And we're not going to be able to tell you that, but we can help you learn it. And then kind of a little bit deeper than that, we're improving the speaker's process and not just their final product. So we want a student to be able to walk out of a session and feel good about their creative skills to create this final outcome and not just that final outcome. And we want to provide skills that this student can use when they're faced with a project similar to this later on, so they're prepared going into it. And also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, but we like to acknowledge the good and the bad. So whether a student is coming in feeling super confident or not, they're often doing things for their process that are already working and are already good kind of tactics and skills to use. So we really want to emphasize those, as well as providing our constructive criticism for what they could improve on. And then also staying focused on the students' goals. So in a session, we might see something that we think is really important to point out, but we're kind of holding back on that until we can really address the students' goals, because ultimately we want them to walk out of the session feeling like they've worked on what's important to them, and not maybe what's important to us. So making sure that we have time to cover those goals before we dive into anything else.
So that was a little bit about what we do as tutors, but now we wanted to reflect a little bit on what that's taught us and what we're going to take from that into the future.
So first up, I think that becoming a speaking fellow has made us be better listeners. engage listeners in terms of if someone's giving a presentation, you want to pay attention so you know what they're talking about. Or if they're answering an interview question, you want to pay attention so you can get feedback on that. But there's a whole other side to this of being a listener where if a student's opening up about their speech anxiety, you want to be an engaged listener so you can provide feedback and kind of give them that space to open up. And it's listening to past stories or fears that they may have or challenges they're facing in this project. So there's kind of two sides to this listening that are very important as a tutor.
Yeah, and on a similar note, it's helped us become better speakers ourselves. By helping so many people practice their own presentations and speeches, we get to see so many ways of practicing, and we get to see so many good speeches, so many bad speeches, and we get to learn from those things and implement those maybe in our own speeches, in our own presentations. So we learn a lot from the people who come into the room, maybe just as much as they might learn from us.
And similarly, we become better interviewees. So this is one because we went through a class to kind of learn how this goes and what makes you a good interviewer and what interviewing and what doesn't. But also we run a lot of mock interviews where we are the interviewer, so we get a clear perspective of what it looks like to be on the other side of that and kind of tactics that are working or tactics that aren't working. And for ourselves, we can kind of pick and choose from that about what would work for us and maybe something new that we're seeing from someone or something that's not being conveyed well and kind of something we want to stray away from. So we're able to learn a lot about how to go into an interview ourselves.
And we learned a lot about thinking about speaking from a lot of different perspectives. Like Campbell said at the beginning, all we knew was that you stand up here, you have slides behind you, and you kind of just present whatever you know. But what we know now is that speaking means a lot of different things, and it looks like a lot of different things. It's a different experience for everybody. And that diversity that we see in our clientele is something that we can also kind of pull from and help make our own speeches more unique and dynamic. And so it really helped us take in a lot about the topic just by exposure to it.
And then I think most importantly what we want to emphasize from this is that speaking skills are something that are continuous learning and growing journey and that are important to kind of practice and cultivate and kind of pay attention to and work on, and that's something that is possible if we want it to be. And I think we both feel very lucky to be involved in so many other people's kind of journey of their voice, but also that this job and this role helped us along ourselves.
Thank you. All right, so if we can have Cam come back up to stage, we're gonna have a little Q&A session. Okay.
Hi, great presentation, thank you. Actually, over the summer I did an internship that was basically a corporate 9 to 5, and I had a lot of remote colleagues. So I guess the question I wanted to ask is do you have any tips on kind of the non-confrontational nature a lot of people have when doing remote work? There's kind of this gag my parents and I kind of have, which is people just say, oh, let's take this offline if they disagree with something you said. They just don't want to talk about it and just want to text about it instead. Do you have any tips about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that with that non-confrontational nature, it helps to think about where it's coming from or what they're really trying to either get at or avoid with that. Because I think, so for example, I think if you're in a big group call and there is a strong discussion, strong disagreement for a couple of people within that big group call, I do think in most scenarios it would be appropriate to, in a sense, that phrase is a little overused, but take it offline. But that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be, oh, let's exchange DMs about this. I think that would be a great opportunity to have a one-on-one call with that, or just have a small call with the folks that are involved. So if you're in a situation where something like that comes up and someone really doesn't seem to, someone really seems to be pushing to have that tougher conversation via DM or in writing, then I think just kind of responding to acknowledge what they're saying, but also say like, hey, if you'd be amenable to this, I really think we could benefit from setting up, a bit of time to actually have a face-to-face video call so that we both have a little more opportunity to really hear each other and understand each other and like get on the same page because, I value our collaboration. I think this is the best format for that. So, yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. That's like, just be more mindful about
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Like, hey, let's just text.
Absolutely.
I like
Cool.
Question for Suchi. Kind of a joke question, but like, what's the worst speech you've seen in this session?
Well, it's not so much that it's a bad speech. It just sometimes there's not too much structure and there's not really an argument. And then we talk about it and we think, what's your argument? And then we start there. And then we kind of build the rest of the presentation around it. That's pretty much the biggest issue I find. They're just kind of talking and it's not really going anywhere. But then we just kind of talk about it and I'll say, hey, like, from what you said, this is what I thought your argument was. Is that what you meant it to be? And they're like, I don't really know. And then we talk about it and then we figure that out. Amy.
I have a question for all three of you. So I'm speaking for everyone here knows. So one thing that I always love hearing from fellows after they graduate is how they're able to take the skills that they learn through tutoring and apply them to other areas of their life. Not just work, but interpersonal relationships, the ways in which they talk to the people that they care about and respect. And so I'm wondering, obviously you guys have not graduated yet, but if you're already seeing ways in which the lessons that you learn both in the class and in your role as speaking fellows is changing the ways in which you communicate or you listen or just sort of interact with people in your real lives. And then Cam, I'd love to hear sort of the 5 years later version of where you see those skills.
I think the biggest one for me is listening, like just like paying more attention to the small things someone said, and also when someone stops talking, not immediately responding, because usually they have something else to say, they're just like working on it. And I notice that with my friends a lot too, because oftentimes we're just like back and forth, but if you just pause for a minute, they usually have something more to say. And then I also think in the ways I give advice, because a lot of my friends obviously come to each other for advice, and I think I used to give it in a very like directed way. Like, you should totally do this, it'll be the right thing. And then I think now I'm much more like open to kind of suggestion and open to like conversation about that, inform it in like a different way.
I definitely agree with a lot of what you said. I have a similar experience, but the other thing that I think about is being more present in my dignity conversation, because I find that like when I'm in a tutoring session, I'm like very much locked into what we're talking about, and for that whole 50 minutes, like there's no other thoughts on my mind, and I'm fully focused on their project and what I can do to help. And I'm not always that locked in when I'm just having a conversation with my family or my friends, but it's something I've tried to be more mindful of, and the way I give like my full attention to a tutee when I'm in the room, like when I leave that kind of session, I feel really fulfilled by it, and I feel like I've given it my full attention and that they've like reciprocated. But I feel like I could do better with doing that in just like personal conversations. So it's been something I've tried to be more mindful of, and just like applying that level of like attention and like care and thinking about what I'm saying and how I'm saying it to people. And that's like helped me have more meaningful conversations just like in my personal life as well.
That makes a lot of sense. I think those are really good answers, and I would definitely expand upon the listening piece. Like I mentioned to a few of you when we were in the other room pizza, that active listening has been a really important skill that I've taken with me from my time as a fellow. And I mean, working in a remote workplace or like just like corporate America, professional environment, I do think that can be really helpful to understand, try to understand the like root of what someone is saying, and even in a different sense, what someone isn't saying. It can be, this is sort of related to that question about like someone who's avoiding confrontation, like trying to understand what it is that they are trying to avoid, or like what they don't want the conversation to become, And that ties into as well what you're saying about non-directive tutoring. And I remember too learning a lot about like focusing on I language and I statements. And I mean that's another huge thing as well when you get into the remote workplace. I mean, literally I'm not exaggerating. The COO of my company once like gave a talk on having tough conversations, and that was like a core part of it, is framing things with I language. And I was like, who are you, Amy Arbogast? But I genuinely, it's so, as simple as it might seem on paper, it is so helpful to have developed a habit through non-directive tutoring of listening to something, knowing on some level like, okay, we've got room to develop here, and in turn immediately phrasing my language is like, okay, so I'm hearing this, and you know, maybe we've got some opportunity. Well, maybe that's a little too far for what we're doing in sessions, but generally responding with I language rather than coming in hard with like, you did this and that was rough. Developing that skill already is going to be really huge for you in the way that you communicate with like your coworkers, and also like having tough, you know, personal conversations. It's definitely helped me in the more unpleasant conversations with my partner remotely and otherwise. So I think it's a great thing to learn.
Thank you guys.
Okay, eight
Thanks
down.
for coming.
Okay, clients out.